In this session, we're going to talk about counterbalancing and confounds. Counterbalancing and order effects. Order effects can be defined as the effect of previous experimental conditions on the current performance of a research participant. And they are of particular concern within subjects' designs. So specifically, if participants complete one condition after another, they may experience increased fatigue or boredom, learning from practice, familiarity in the second condition. And it's also possible that the effects of a prior experimental manipulation might linger in the second condition. This might affect the participants' responses and confound the results of the study. So we'll look at some examples of this. So first of all, fatigue. So if participants are completing a lot of different conditions, it might mean that they are less alert and attentive towards the end of the study. And this is especially problematic in studies that are quite long and quite demanding and draining. Boredom might result in a similar state in that participant might be less alert, less attentive towards the end of the study, and they might also engage in more mind wandering. And this is likely when the task is repetitive and perhaps not challenging or interesting enough. Practice effects. So participants might start to perform better in later conditions because they've had a chance to practice whatever it is that they're doing. And this might be more likely to be a problem when the task is quite unfamiliar or strange and takes a while to get a hang of. And familiarity. So at the start of the study, participants may still be getting used to being in the potentially unusual experimental setting. For example, being in the lab, being in an fMRI scanner, feeling like they're being observed, or even using a specific computer to complete the task. So they might feel more comfortable and actually perform better towards the end of the study as they will have gotten familiar with being in the testing situation. And lingering manipulation refers to when the participant's state was altered in the first block, and that this might accidentally also last or linger into the second block or subsequent blocks. So for example, if we are trying to manipulate participants' moods or mindsets, it might be the case that some of this persists. And we'll also consider potential differences in differences. So some of these effects may differ systematically between participants and groups. So for example, if we're comparing children and adults, it's possible that fatigue and boredom might influence younger children more. If, for example, the task is solving difficult math problems or something like that. And this might also be a problem when participants in different groups do different tasks. So for example, if we have a control task that is a lot less cognitively demanding, it might mean that the treatment group ends up experiencing a lot more fatigue throughout the study, and that can influence how they perform in the final outcome measure. The order of the conditions might influence participants' understanding of the study purpose, which might lead to problems with demand characteristics. It might also influence how participants respond to the second task. So for example, if we're assessing students' subjective sense of success as a student, and we're also asking them how many lectures they think that they will miss in the upcoming semester. Responding to one of these first might make participants feel like the second response should be aligned with the first. So for example, if they have reported that they are a very successful student, they might feel like, maybe I should intend to not miss any lectures at all, for example. And it might generally influence how the participants interpret the second question. So by having these two questions together, it might be implied that the researchers think that a successful student will not miss lectures, for example. And due to practical reasons, data collection for different groups or conditions may be done at different times of the year by different researchers or in different contexts, for example, in two different schools, or you might be collecting data from patients in a hospital and invite a control group to complete the study in the research lab. So for example, if we wanted to compare psychology and philosophy students' perceptions of their workloads and stress levels, we might invite our psychology students in September and October, and then the philosophy students in November and December. The problem with this is that the philosophy students would be tested closer to the exam time, and in this time, workloads and stress levels may be higher for all students. So this is not a good comparison of these two different groups of students. As another example, if we're looking at subjective experiences of home students and international students in a qualitative research project, we might have different researchers lead different groups to reduce the workload, for example. And it might be the case that one is more friendly or patient, which might make participants feel more comfortable and in some ways feel more comfortable to open up about more difficult experiences, for example. And on the other hand, even if we have the same researcher and we might mix the students up so that they're not in different groups, it might be that that specific person is more relatable to some participants than others. For example, if they are an international student themselves. How can we reduce the impact of order effects? Some researchers will try to minimize the effects by having participants complete pre-training or extensive familiarization. So the idea of this is to make sure all participants are familiar with the environment and the basic task and using the technology and so on. Another thing we can do is to measure the impact of the order effects. So to do this, we would expose different participants to different orders of conditions and then statistically measure the influence of the order by making the condition orders an independent variable. And relatedly, you will often see some form of counterbalancing in which we assign the different conditions in different orders for different participants. And the goal of this is to spread out the order effects so that the average results are unaffected by the order effects. So counterbalancing is when we arrange a series of experimental conditions or treatments in such a way as to minimize the influence of order effects on experimental results. So a very simple form of counterbalancing would be to administer the experimental conditions so that half of the participants start with condition A and then they do condition B, and then the other half would start with B and finish with condition A. And when there are more than two conditions, we can use a Latin square. So when we have 3 or more conditions, it's actually quite complicated to calculate the number of required orders. So we use a Latin square, which is a type of within-subject design in which treatments or conditions are administered in sequences that are systematically varied, such that each treatment occurs equally often in each position of the sequence. So that could be first, second, third, etc. So for example, if we have an experimental design with 4 different treatments, the first order would be A, B, C, and D. The second order would be B, C, D, and A. Then the third order, C, D, A, and B. The fourth order, D, A, B, and C. So you can see that it's not the case that we have all possible combinations here, but each of these different treatments will be represented in each of the 4 positions equally often. So A is first one time, A is second one time, and it's third one time, and it's fourth one time, for example. And we do need to have an equal number of people complete the tasks in each order for this to all balance out. So how to use what you've just learned about order effects and counterbalancing in your critical evaluations. So when you've read a paper, you can ask yourself whether the design and the procedure of the study introduces any potential order effects, which may have influenced the results of the study. And you can also reflect on whether the researchers could have avoided this, and if so, how. For example, using counterbalancing. And in many cases, you might find that the researchers have included an adequate counterbalancing, which can be reported as a strength of the study. Now moving on to confounds more broadly. So what does confound or confound mean? So to confound means to mix up something with something else so that the individual elements become difficult to distinguish. This is one of the definitions of this word. You can look it up. It's quite a confusing, confounding word. In research that investigates a potential cause and effect relationship, a confounding variable is an unmeasured third variable that influences both the supposed cause and the supposed effect. This is also referred to as a confounder, confounding factor, extraneous determinant, or lurking variable, amongst other things. And typically, a third variable is a confounder when it is correlated with the independent variable in the study. And this could be a causal relationship, but it does not have to be. And when it is causally related to the dependent variable. And at the core of why this is a problem, confounding variables result in the incomparability of 2 or more groups or conditions. So to explain this a bit further, so why does this matter? So if we do not consider confounding variables, our results may not reflect the actual relationship between the variables that we are interested in. So as an example, researchers might want to compare boys and girls' programming skills. And if they don't account for confounds in access to programming classes, which might vary systematically between boys and girls for different reasons, they might find a cause and effect relationship that does not actually exist. So they might say that girls just happen to be better at programming, for example, but it might be the case that they just have more experience. And on the other hand, confounds might also mean that we fail to find a relationship which does actually exist in the general population. So for example, if you want to test running speed in adults aged between 40 and 85 years old, And they find no relationship between weekly gym attendance and running speed. So it could be that a retirement status might be a confound here, in that it might be associated both with participants' age and their gym attendance. Let's think about something that would not be a confound. So if a researcher randomly assigns people to sit in one of two different rooms, one room is messy, one is clean, and they want to explore differences in their chess playing ability. You might say, well, what if all the people in the messy room just also happen to have taken a lot of chess lessons? That can happen, which is why we need to use big sample sizes to make this less likely, and we need to replicate studies and so on. But this would be a statistical fluke, and it would not be considered a confound because it's not systematically related to the independent and dependent variables. And now something that might be a confound. So imagine this classic design where researchers ask children to delay gratification by waiting to eat a marshmallow that's put in front of them. And we might want to see does this predict the children's grades 5 years later. So what if some kids had never had marshmallows before? Would that be a confound? Well, so eating marshmallows at home in itself seems unlikely to predict grades, but having access to marshmallows could be an indicator of something else. So it might relate to the parenting style or the financial circumstances, for example. And if access to marshmallows would be related to both their ability to delay gratification in the study and the grades, it would be a potential confound. So there are different ways to reduce the impact of confounding variables. Randomization, matching, restriction, and statistical control. So randomization, you randomize the values of your independent variable to minimize the impact of the confounding variable. So specifically, you assign people randomly to a control or a treatment group. And with a sufficiently large sample size, the idea is that all the potential person confounding variables should have the same average between the different groups. And since we then can feel confident that these variables do not differ by group assignment, they cannot correlate with the independent variable and they can't confound the study. However, this approach does not work for theoretical constructs that are not possible or ethical to randomly assign, for example, like cognitive ability, personality traits, attitudes, age, and so on. But it's a big reason why we will use this random assignment when it is possible. Matching. So here we match each member of the comparison group to a counterpart in the treatment group with the same values of potential confounders. So then we can feel more confident that potential differences in confounding variables are unlikely to cause the variation in the outcomes between the treatment group and comparison group. So for example, we wanted to study differences in alcohol consumption between regular, quote-unquote, football fans and American football fans in a sample of students at a UK university. A confound might be that football preferences might vary by nationality, and perhaps alcohol consumption would also vary by nationality. So if we were using matching to reduce the impact of this confound, we would make sure that for each American football fan that we include that is from the US, we'll make sure to also include a US person in the regular football fan group. So then we would have an equal number of people from different nationalities, and that confound would be less of an issue. Restriction. So we restrict the sample by only including participants with the same values of potential confounding factors. Then, if the values do not differ among the participants, they can't confound the cause and effect relationship. So, for example, we could include only children in the marshmallow study who report eating marshmallows once or twice a month. Then we can feel more confident that the study outcome was not driven by differences in previous exposure to marshmallows in the sample. If you collect relevant data, you can include the possible confounders as control variables. So you might see researchers add, for example, age, years of education, or sweet treats per week into their regression model. Or they might report a control analysis where they compare grades between children who ate sweets more or less often. And this would help us quantify the potential impact of the suspected confound. Although I will note that controlling for confounds statistically is quite tricky and it's not a magical fix. There's a lot of literature on the sort of pros and cons of this, but it is one way to approach this problem. And now we'll look at some different types of confounds. So far, we've mainly been referring to person-related confounds, but there are also operational and procedural confounds. So person confounding, so that refers to the situation where two or more groups of units are analyzed together. So as an example, we're comparing workers from different occupations, but they actually happen to vary according to one or more other characteristics, such as gender. So that means that the two groups of workers are incomparable in the sense that they differ systematically in a different way than intended. Operational confounding occurs when a measure that is designed to assess a particular construct accidentally measures something else as well, or instead. So for example, if we're measuring maths ability using long, complex verbal math problems, we are unintentionally also measuring language ability. Or if we're measuring intelligence with an IQ test, and this test might incorporate examples from a specific cultural context, the scores will reflect a combination of IQ and cultural knowledge. And importantly, this operational confounding might influence the accuracy of the intended outcome measure more for some participants than it does for others. So for example, if we have some children who are completing these math problems in a language that isn't their first language, this verbal confounding might have more of a detrimental impact on the accuracy of the score in the sense that the test isn't a good measure of their math ability, for example. And that could then lead us to falsely conclude that the children whose first language isn't English, for example, have poor math ability. And that would be a type of confounding that would really undermine the conclusions of the study. Procedural confounding occurs when the researcher mistakenly allows another variable to change along with the manipulated independent variable. So for example, we want to explore how depleting participants' self-control affects their generosity by having some participant in the control group play a fun video game for a couple of hours, whereas we had the other group solving difficult math problems. So that's intended to deplete their self-control. However, this manipulation might also change the participants' mood or energy levels, which could in turn influence their generosity. Procedural and operational confounding are both common in psychological research, as we have to reduce complex theoretical constructs into operational measures. And very few if any at all, of our psychological measures are truly process pure. So that is, they are not measuring only one specific psychological process. So if you do identify potential procedural or operational confounding, think about whether these confounds are likely to systematically influence the study outcome. And if that is not the case, it is not necessarily a problem that whatever we were measuring was also capturing something else. Whatever we were manipulating also might have manipulated something else, as long as it is also measuring and manipulating the things that we did intend to measure. Still, though, I think these are often overlooked, and they are very important when we are evaluating research. How can you apply this when you're critically evaluating a research paper? So think about whether the design and the procedure of the study introduces any potential confounds. So that could be person, operational, or procedural confounds. In other words, is there something that might systematically differ between the conditions or groups other than the thing or the construct that the researchers were trying to measure that might influence the findings or the outcome of the study? If that is the case, think about whether the researchers could have avoided or reduced the impact of this, and if so, how? But as always, don't be too critical. So do think critically about whether something in the methodology introduces order effects or potential confounds that might influence the study's outcome, and explain how the confounds might be related to the different variables, and suggest solutions and improvements if possible, but don't make unfounded claims, and don't overstate the importance of any potential order effects or confounds. Unless these things were actually measured, we can only really speculate about the impact.